Aren't we only as strong as the mate we have by our side? Isn't the tie that binds one friend to another the most unbreakable bond of all? Whether it exists only as a memory, be it a union born from despair, should you be one of many in triumph, isn't it mateship that defines us? In recent times, against a dramatic and difficult backdrop, it was a friendship that defined an entire, not only held together, they were strengthened.
75 years ago in 1942, that the Battle of the Coral Sea began. The Coral Sea lies off the Queensland coast, east of cities like Townsville and Mackay. Roughly speaking, it stretches out to countries like Vanuatu and New Caledonia, and north to the southeast coast of Papua New Guinea. The Battle of the Coral Sea has been described as the largest naval battle ever fought so close to Australia. But while it was a naval battle, it was fought entirely by aircraft that attacked ships, and the battle ran until May 8. In that time, on the Allied side, Australia and the United States, close to 660 lives were lost. On the Japanese side, almost 1,000 lives. The Battle of the Coral Sea has also been described as the touchstone for the strategic relationship between Australia and the United States. One report recently said the Coral Sea battle cemented the US-Australia partnership in blood in the Pacific, just as the Empire of Japan was brutally taking over the Pacific in World War II. We have the outstanding director of the Australian War Memorial. None does it better than this man, Dr. Brendan Nelson. And he will be there tomorrow morning as well, but he's on the line from New York at the moment. Brendan, good morning to you.
Good morning to you, Alan.
Thank you, as always, for your time, and we love your history lessons. So can you just tell us, it's May 1942. Where are we, broadly speaking, in terms of the progress of the war, particularly the war in the Pacific?
Essentially, Alan, we're at a point where we have our back to the wall. The Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941. They had simultaneously landed on the Malay Peninsula and bombed US facilities in the Philippines. They'd made a rapid sweeping advance down through Southeast Asia, and then, of course, on the 15th of February, Fortress Singapore fell, and with it 130,000 British and Allied troops went into captivity, including 15,000 Australians. And 4 days later, on the 19th of February, of course, we had the bombing of Darwin, in which some 260 people were killed, including 88 American defence personnel. And then, of course, we had a series of further bombings of the Australian mainland. In every sense of the word, we had our backs to the wall, our vital interests were at stake, and our wartime Prime Minister, John Curtin, said of the fall of Singapore that in the same way that Dunkirk had led to the Battle of Britain, so too the fall of Singapore would lead to the Battle of Australia, and that the defence of this country would no longer be that of a contribution to a world at war, but to resist an enemy that was threatening to invade.
It's a brilliant summation, as always, from you. So basically, when you put all of that together, and we're coming up to Coral Sea, but you talk about Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, you mentioned Guam, Hong Kong, Malaya, and so on. So basically, it is fair to say, when we ask where are we in 1942, that this string of Japanese victories has now left them, at this point, masters of Southeast Asia, and they've got a foothold in the Southwest Pacific.
Exactly, Alan, and the Japanese were extremely confident that nothing would stand in their way, and they had a plan for a greater East Asia prosperity sphere. They wanted to control and dominate these countries that had resources such as rubber and timber and copper, food, and a whole range of resources that were so essential to them. And, in fact, Admiral Yamamoto, who was the Commander-in-Chief of the Japanese Combined Fleet, he, in fact, proposed plans to invade Hawaii, Ceylon, Australia, and other Japanese military leaders thought they should be invading New Zealand, India, Alaska and Central America. I mean, that's how confident they were.
Absolutely. Just coming back on that. So here we are, May 1942, May 4, 1942. In March, only a couple of months beforehand, Emperor Hirohito had approved a plan, did he not, by the Japanese military to occupy Papua, Fiji, Samoa, part of the Solomons, Nauru, the Ocean Islands. What was the aim of that?
Well, the intention was, because you've got to understand, Alan, of course, this was an imperialist, militarist Japan, expansionist view of the world, and they had every reason, in fact, to be confident that nothing would stand in their way. And it was about not only building this empire, but also controlling the rich resources that lay in the region, including, of course, the then Dutch East Indies and, to some extent, Australia.
Well, we often hear, you mentioned Australia, we often hear suggestions about an invasion of Australia. Was that ever on the cards?
Well, it wasn't really. But in 1942, if you were an Australian, you had every reason to believe that this was going to happen. We now know that the Japanese plan was, in fact, to get control of Port Moresby. What they wanted was a seaborne invasion of Port Moresby. And the reason for that was to secure the southern perimeter of the Japanese advance, to cut off the supply lines for the Americans from Australia to New Guinea, and also, having secured Port Moresby, they'd then be able to run bombing operations into northeast Australia. But at that time, John Curtin, in fact, worked very hard to convince Australians that our vital interests were at stake, which they most certainly were. But we now know there was no developed plan to invade Australia. But I say to the people who are very critical of those who quite rightly commemorate the battle for Australia, I say to them, well, if the Japanese had prevailed, if they had got Moresby, and they had prevailed in the Coral Sea, which we'll speak about in a moment, they would have had to have done something about Australia. They had to contain the American presence here, apart from it.
Is it true that I understand that we had a bit of luck in that we're able to crack some of the Japanese codes, and that enabled the Allies to identify plans to invade Port Moresby?
Yes, that's right. In fact, some of our elements that were working in Victoria, are Australian and British elements in Melbourne, and also the US intelligence were able to intercept the communications of the Japanese Naval Task Group. And in fact, it was called ultra intelligence. In other words, it was above the highest level of communication the British then had. So it in one sense it was luck, but in another highly...
But it did enable, did it not, the American fleet with Australian assistance then to be able to be diverted to tackle the Japanese. So what sorts of forces were arrayed against each other here, Australia, US vis-a-vis Japan?
Well, the Americans made a very brave decision. After Pearl Harbor, they had not been decimated, but the cupboard was pretty bare in terms of their naval capability, and they committed 2 full carrier task forces to go into the Coral Sea. And so what we had was, on the United States and Australian side, we had 2 full fleet carriers, 9 cruisers, 13 destroyers, 2 oilers, and 128 carrier planes. The Japanese, about the same, but more, because they had an invading task group. So they also had 2 big fleet carriers. They had 9 cruisers, 15 destroyers, an oiler, and they had about the same number of planes, 127, but they also had minesweepers, another light carrier, and then they had 12 transport ships and submarine chasers.
So how significant was the Australian component in the context of our total military might?
Well, our Navy basically put everything into it, Alan.
Yeah.
We put in HMAS Australia 2, which was our heavy cruiser. We also put in HMAS Hobart. You've got to keep in mind, Sydney 2 had been lost with all hands in November 1941. We'd also lost Perth in the Sunda Strait in late February.
Yep.
Canberra was having a refit, and it would subsequently be lost at Savo Island. And the older Adelaide was also in a refit. So we put the only 2 real ships that we had that were capable of doing anything, we put into this. And very proudly, of course, so you had the 2 US carrier task groups, but the third task group, I should say,
Jack Fletcher, yeah. Now, the Battle of the Coral Sea really, though, gave the US Navy its first opportunity, did it not, to challenge the Japanese Navy, and as you've identified, with roughly equivalent forces. But it was a naval battle fought by aircraft. Am I right in saying the opposing warships never really came into direct contact with one another?
Exactly, Alan. In fact, this was the very first time where ships had not faced off directly against one another, and indeed we'd had carriers fighting one another. The Japanese and American aircraft carriers never got within 100 kilometres of one another, and the fighting was done by the planes, which were being obviously deployed from each of the carrier groups.
Right.
And it was a grouping battle.
How significant was this battle in terms of the overall war?
Alan, this was absolutely critical. In fact, Douglas MacArthur said victory in the Coral Sea undoubtedly saved Australia from a definite and immediate threat. And John Curtin, speaking in Parliament whilst the battle was going on, he said, and I quote, "Our front line is the sea. Men there are fighting for Australia today." What happened in this whole battle of the Coral Sea was that the Japanese sunk a bit more Allied shipping than we had done of them. But as a consequence of the battle, because they'd lost a light carrier, because they'd lost most of the planes on their second carrier, which had also been damaged, they then were not able to fully deploy the next month into the Battle of Midway, where they got hammered. And the other thing that was extraordinarily important, that Jack Grace, commanding the 2 Australian ships and the 4 American ships, principally Chicago and Perkins, he was able to prevent the Japanese landing task group, the invasion task group, to get through to Moresby. And so, very, very courageously, we were able to prevent the Japanese from getting their objectives.
Yeah, Prime Minister Curtin said at the time, "I've no doubt that other battles have yet to be fought as part of the struggle, which must continue until the enemy is defeated or we are conquered." Now, look, you're there in America. What do you think we're going to see and hear at this commemoration service tomorrow, our time?
Well, most importantly, Alan, in my opinion, we will see and hear something of the veterans who actually fought these battles, both American and Australian. And I think it's a credit to our government, supported by Qantas, that they've actually brought a number of our veterans over for this. I also will be looking forward to hearing President Trump and Prime Minister Turnbull remind us of the importance of this alliance. It was, as you said earlier, forged in blood in the Coral Sea. I mean, the origins of the Australia-US alliance come out of the Battle of the Coral Sea. It was formalised in 1951. And as you and your listeners know only too well, we are living in a world of extraordinary uncertainty and, in fact, immense danger. And more than ever, it's essential that Australia be reminded, as I do at the War Memorial every day, we are allies of the United States. We're not just good friends. We are, if you like, we're mates. We're not friends. And so I will be looking forward very much to seeing, hearing and feeling something of the mutual commitment that lies in this. And I'd also say, Alan, you get a bit of this. I get it every day. I get people who are critical of the United States. Now, there are lots of things to be critical about, but there is not a day goes by in this country where we should not stop to thank and reflect upon American sacrifice in the Pacific from 1942 to the end of the war. 300,000 casualties, 103,000 dead, half their bodies never found, and the continuing US presence in our region has been the bedrock of our stability and our economic prosperity.
Good on you.
And
wonderful
what
stuff.
I want to hear about tomorrow.
Wonderful stuff, Brendan. Thank you for your time, and we wish you well. He's out many times here. Don't kid yourself that we are not involved in a war of a different kind in 2017. It's a cultural war. Extraordinary claims in a Sydney court yesterday. 3 men, as you know, are facing charges of supporting the teenager who shot dead the New South Wales police employee Curtis Cheng back in 2015. The court heard that one of the alleged conspirators, Rabban Alu, and a female associate heard a news broadcast about Mr. Cheng's murder. And the female allegedly said, "Good, that job is done then." Prosecutors allege the comments were made just before 9 p.m. on October 2, 2015, as the pair heard a radio broadcast of a statement from the then Police Commissioner Andrew Scipione. A Crown statement of allegations at the committal hearing in the Downing Centre local court said Alou, who was under police surveillance at the time, could be heard speaking and humming in the background. The 19-year-old's accused of giving the teenage killer Farhad Jabbar, 15 he was, the pistol at Parramatta Mosque shortly before Jabbar killed Mr Cheng at 4:30 p.m. on October 2, 2015. 2 other men are in court with Alou this week, and the hearing provides, as I've said many times, a chilling insight into the hatred these people have for Australia and our way of life. And they have to be cleaned out, root and branch, unapologetically. And we have to know how much of this is being nurtured in classrooms and mosques. And if it's a culture war, then we and our government representing us must make sure we win them. To this point, the government's been utterly pigeon-livered. There is a cultural war on, and if we don't win it, everything that our men and women fought for in the Battle of the Coral Sea or at Gallipoli is completely forsaken. Could you describe what the Battle of the Coral Sea did in terms of the relationship between your country and mine?
Well, Alan, I think, it's important to sort of step back and look at the picture between 1941 and 42. The end of 1941 in December, Pearl Harbor is bombed, and the same commander that bombs Pearl Harbor then turns around and bombs Darwin, killing 243 Australians. And so both of our countries begin the new year, 1942, having been maliciously attacked, and both of us have lost a great number of our citizens. But what happens now in 42 is another series of the Empire of Japan's victories. So Singapore falls, Malaya falls, Hong Kong falls. It's beginning to think, people are starting to think the Empire of Japan is invincible, that they're unstoppable. And so one could argue we're all playing defense until the middle of 1942. We're under attack, and people are wondering, are we going to be able to ever shift to offense? Well, what happens is Australians and Americans decode a message that says that Japan is going to invade Port Moresby and aiming to invade Australia. And as soon as that was decoded, both our navies jumped to. The United States only had 2 carriers below the equator at that point in history. You could say if Nimitz was a careful man, he might have only put one. Nimitz threw everything we had into the game. He said both carriers, Lexington and Yorktown, steaming towards this, encouraged the Australians to send whatever they could, and so the Hobart and Australia and other support ships come along, and over an amazing 5 days of battle on May 4th through the 9th, Japan has stopped. Their invasion is turned around. They're no longer proven invincible. And for the first time, the Allies go in the offense in the Pacific, and they stay on the offense. 4 weeks later, Midway, another victory. 8 weeks later, Guadalcanal, where my father fought with the 1st Marine Division, dropped off by some of the same Australian sailors that we're honoring tomorrow night, turns out to be another victory. So by the end of 42, what began as a very dark, depressed period in both of our histories ends on a much higher note where we've taken the offensive and we never give it back.
That is magnificent. And this is John Berry, but I mean, what he has just said, and this is, I suppose, a forlorn hope, should be played in every classroom in the nation. Every classroom in the nation. I heard you, John, talking yesterday, paying tribute to the veterans who fought in the battle, and you mentioned a quote from the US television journalist Tom Brokaw, who said, "Not just a great generation, but the greatest generation." You said, "These are true heroes. These are young men who are put into the most trying of circumstances of life and death all around them, and God bless them. Because of them, we enjoy freedom and democracy today." Do you think, or are we just a little jaundiced, do you think enough people today realise that link between what those men did back then and the freedoms we enjoy today?
Well, Alan, I hope, with patriots like you and so many other broadcasters in both of our countries, one of the things we hope, and having the leaders of both of our country on the Intrepid tomorrow, the National Press Corps of the United States and the National Press Corps of Australia will be beaming live from the Intrepid the speech of the President and the Prime Minister, and as well as the honoring of the surviving veterans. And I hope this generation watches and learns, because there is no better teacher of the lessons that we need to hold dear, of the values that sustain our republics, our democracies, than is reflected in the lives of these heroes. I'll tell you, Alan, I picked them up from the airport yesterday after being in the air for over 28 hours. These guys are in their mid-90s. Not one complaint, ear to ear, grins, so proud to be here, can't wait to get on that ship. They're just like, let's go. And, anybody, all the other people coming out of the baggage claim looked like they'd been beaten with baseball bats. These people, 95, storming out of there without a complaint. Oh, my God, what a great role model they are for this generation today.
What a great ambassador you are. Unbelievable. There's people at home, I'm sure, listening to this crying. It's just fantastic. We don't get enough of it. Just before you go, you were saying yesterday how America relies heavily on Australia for advice, and that Australia was instrumental in shaping US policy in the region and so on. But I love this bit. And this is germane to the problem we face today here, and you face it in America. We've got all sorts of statutory authorities, and you're afraid to speak. If you speak up, you're either a misogynist or Islamophobic or some damn thing, and people are frightened into silence. And you said, we have a lot of people who say yes or agree. We don't respect that. We respect Australians because they take positions and they're not afraid to express them in an unvarnished way. You said Australia, I hope you're right. We're fighting to retain this, John, I've got to tell you. But you said Australia is a sovereign nation that makes its own judgments and its own decisions, and we respect that mightily. We want to hear when we're going wrong, and we deeply value your backing when we're going right. Fantastic. Just amplify that.
Well, Alan, there are a lot of people who want to say that somehow, Australia, should say no to the U.S. more. Australia says no to the United States almost every week. The best advice I got when I was ambassador, Alan, was the time, Dennis Richardson, or a dear friend, or he would call me up and just say, "You guys are just dumb wrong on that." It was precious advice, and and 9 times out of 10 they turned out to be right. I have to say, a couple times they admitted that I was right a couple times.
Well, now, John, I got to tell you, the great thing about radio,
that's how the relationship is.
I know. The great thing about radio is what you've just said is a part of the record here, and I can assure you I will be playing that and sending that to many, many outlets. We've got to hear that message. I'm so grateful that you've spent some time with us this morning. Have a wonderful night tomorrow night. We'll be with you in spirit, and all those sentiments that you expressed, understand, are shared by the overwhelming majority of Australians.
Well, God bless you, sir, and your listeners as well. I hope everyone will take a moment tomorrow and join us with the moment of silence that we'll be having on the Intrepid. We're honoring the living veterans, but we will also remember those who paid the ultimate sacrifice.
Absolutely.
And the table that will be in front of the president, Alan, just so you know, the table will be set with 2 place settings, one for the Australian servicemen and one for the American servicemen, who, with a votive candle there, because they couldn't join us because they paid their ultimate sacrifice.
Beautiful.
So we'll be honoring them as well. I hope everyone across Australia will join us in a moment of silence. God bless Australia, and God bless the United States of America.
Thank you so much. There is a